Well, welcome to folks that are already online. We're going to give it just a few minutes to let folks start trickling in, and we'll kick it off here probably in about 1 to 2 minutes. Just one more quick reminder for everyone who's on, and so people aren't worried that they're not hearing their audio. We're just waiting for a few more folks to join us, so giving it probably about another 60 seconds or so for people to join, and then we will kick off our webinar. Numbers still rising, which is great. All right, so I think with that, we are reaching a slowing down of the numbers and can hopefully kick off our webinar for everyone. So thank you to everyone for joining us today for our webinar, Resilient by Design, obviously evolving your verification stack against modern fraud. By way of introductions, my name is Adam Bossia. I lead product marketing at Mitek Systems. Joining me today is Maxine Most, who is the founder and CEO of the Prism project. So hi, Maxine.
Hi, how are you today, Adam?
Doing really, really well. So glad to have you on. I'm excited to kind of kick off the webinar and really talk through some topics that I know both you and I are pretty passionate about. So with that, just a handful of housekeeping items. First, for any questions that you'd like to submit, please do so using the available questions section versus the general chat. That way we can be sure to cover them during the Q&A portion at the end. And second, for those who are interested, we will be recording this webinar and a copy will be sent out to all registered attendees. So with that, I'm going to kick us off. So before we fully dive in, I actually wanted to call out a couple of data points from a recent Deloitte study that I think really highlight why we're here today and talking about this topic. As you can see, the cost and really what I should say is the scale of the threat posed by generative AI fraud is terrifying. And bear in mind that these stats are just for the banking sector alone. And secondarily, of course, that bottom stat is also a not so subtle reminder that customers are always going to look to businesses to be the ones that protect them and mitigate risk. So I just thought these were some really good stats to kind of frame up why we're having this conversation. And so, Maxine, I know, again, this is a problem that is near and dear to your heart. So if you want, why don't you kick us off by maybe explaining a bit about the Prism project first so people understand what that is, and then the role that identity verification plays in mitigating fraud.
Absolutely. And I think these numbers are only getting worse. And as you said, the numbers that we see are incredibly large, and yet it's pretty clear they're not comprehensive. This is a huge problem. It's increasing, and the role of the evolution of AI is accelerating it in ways that even a few years ago, I don't think many of us who've been involved in the identity space for a long time could imagine. So I created something called the Prism Project. And the point of the Prism Project is literally to make sense out of the digital identity ecosystem. And originally, this started with a market landscape framework that we put together, which we call the Prism. If you want to go ahead and, there we go, next slide, there we go. So the Prism is a way to conceptualize this large identity ecosystem that exists in the world. And the thing that I think that is really critically important, and particularly for folks in the financial services space, is that this is really complicated. And even people who have been in the industry for a really long time don't understand every single piece. So we tried to create this Prism paradigm to help folks within vertical markets specifically here, we're talking about financial services really today, to be able to understand and evaluate this ecosystem and understand how they can deploy the technologies and solutions that are being developed to enhance the capabilities that they have within their organization to secure their consumer data and their own data. At the end of the day, this is all about facilitating the global digital ecosystem that is not going to stop. And the question is, how do we address all of the fraud threats that are evolving? And so what we want to do is think about how we can assess the needs within a specific organization and make this accessible to anybody. You don't have to be an expert to understand it. And so what we do at the Prism project is we create a series of reports that are designed not for identity experts, but for vertical market experts that are trying to understand how identity can be used within their organizations and their sectors to basically thwart the fraud that is emerging and keep their data secure and safe. And so the reports provide independent assessments and analysis. They really link the strategic priorities for large and small and medium-sized enterprises to the specific capabilities that biometric-centric digital identity can deliver. And this is really helpful for those who are trying to understand how to evaluate and deploy the technologies. It's also really useful for people that understand these technologies are critical to help them sell that approval up the chain, so to speak, right? This is something that the fraud folks may really intimately understand, people who are in fraud and payments, for example, but they have to sell that to their organizations. We understand that so that you can deploy the tech. So this gives you the kind of the tools and the context and the information to do that. And it also links that to real world examples of organizations like Mitek that are actually solving these problems today. This is not some futuristic capability that's going to be available at some point in the future. There are literally tens of thousands of organizations across the globe that are implementing these technologies to make their organizations more resilient in the face of just unbelievably complex and increasingly terrifying, to use your word, Adam, fraud.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's no small feat either. So it's really impressive to see something like these reports when they come out. Like you do such a good job of creating something that's easily understandable. And I know obviously one of the pieces in it, and one of the things that's obviously near and dear to my heart, since I am actually in the identity space, is the verification process. So I know you have a little bit of the Prism project to walk through for identity verification.
Yeah, and these reports, by the way, are all available to download for free. So this is really about making information available to the community. And as Adam suggested, one of the things that we do is we create models to help people conceptually understand what's happening in the industry. And this is something, this first model, I think, is really important and useful. And it actually grew out of work that was developed by an organization called the Kantara Initiative that gathered the brain trust of people from across the identity ecosystem to kind of develop a conceptual process. And that was done at a pretty technical level. And what we've done here is to use that, and we've elevated it to more of a conceptual level. So normal human beings who don't have to be technology geeks or identity nerds can understand. And so what we've done is we've broken down this identity verification process into 4 major steps and into 3 channels. And the 3 channels are biometrics, credentials, and then environmental risk signals. And the idea is for each of these channels, you have to capture data, process that data, and then drive that data into an identity verification engine that can then help an organization make a decision. And what this diagram shows in particular that's really important is you'll see these little red triangles and squares and circles. And what those symbols are representing is the places within this process where you are vulnerable to fraud threats. And I think this is important because people generally come to this process with some idea in their head of a particular fraud vector that they're very, very concerned about. And they want to be able to solve that problem. But what you need to understand is these attacks exist across the entire ecosystem and across the entire process. And so when you're thinking about these different components, the data that you're capturing, you have to think about all the different ways that that data can be compromised, and that can impact the decisions that you're making about verifying individuals.
Absolutely. And I think that's a really great primer, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about vulnerabilities sort of throughout the webinar, but I did first want to sort of set the stage around the industry too, from this side of the house, about how we've, historically addressed vulnerabilities. So, in the industry, what we typically have done, right, is we try to fill holes. So if there's an injection attack, we start looking for virtual cameras, right? Which is great. I mean, that is one way to do it. But like, what if that attacker is using a face morph in real time so that it is an actual person and they are live and they're in front of the device's real camera? Well, whoops, we missed that. And that's really the biggest shift that we needed to make as a fraud prevention company, right? It's also what I think, the rest of the industry is sort of starting to wake up to. So what we did is we brought together all of these different pieces into one holistic solution, trying to provide a multi-layered defense rather than just focusing.
So all those little dots, those triangles, those circles, those squares that exist sort of like people are playing whack-a-mole, individually trying to attack them. What you're talking about is this holistic approach to looking at the entire process. And I think that's really critically important.
Exactly. So even if something gets past one or two of the checks, it's going to get caught by the fourth, the fifth, or the 15th check, right? And that is honestly, for now at least, something that is relatively unique to us, right? Like, we at Mitek not only have this banking grade technology, but we understand that layered approach is really the best way to actually sort of not only keep fraud out, but it doesn't change the customer dynamic or add too much friction. And that's really important. And I think the other piece for us is that approach also helps our customers not only solve for today, right? Because you mentioned it, right? People are thinking about a specific attack. This is the one I'm worried about right now, but also the one that's coming in 2 weeks, the one that they don't already know about, right? So
yeah, and the fraudsters are smart. They go for the low-hanging fruit. They're going to find the place where they can easily attack. And then, okay, so if you plug that place, then they're going to move somewhere else. So if you don't have a holistic approach, then you're not really addressing your vulnerabilities.
Yeah, I was actually at a REM Roundtable conference yesterday, and one of the banking clients that we were talking to mentioned that fraud is basically like water, i.e., it will find the path of least resistance. It will always flow to wherever it is that there is a hole or a crack for it to get to get through.
Yeah, and there's so many places where you can attack. That's, again, I think that's why that diagram is so important, is that you have to really understand that your top 10 fraud concerns are not all there are. There are many, many more, and we're going to, as this ecosystem evolves, those attacks are going to evolve. And so if you're not taking this kind of whole system approach, you're going to be constantly playing whack-a-mole. You're going to be constantly trying to, stick your finger in the dike, so to speak, to stick with the water metaphor.
yeah, exactly. Chewing gum on the dam does not always help.
Right.
What I will say, and actually this is kind of just to make it a bit more real to what we were just talking about, right? Like, I like to think of defenses as filters, like fraud filters, essentially. Right. So on that base level IDV front, there's a portrait to selfie comparison to make sure that the person that's presenting the ID matches the person that's holding it. Great. And we'll check for liveness, right? We'll check for NFC chip information on IDs that have them, like passports. But then there's a whole slew of additional checks that can look specifically for injection attacks, for digital manipulation, deepfake art attacks, and honestly, even like trends in historical data, so that we keep filtering out more and more sophisticated threats. So, again, the thing I mentioned earlier about virtual cameras, if that's determining if there's a virtual camera being used, great. But maybe it's checking to see if it's the same face that appears too many times in a row, because frankly, we can see the same person 20 times in 30 minutes.
Well, and the other thing too, Adam, that happens is people forget, you can have insider attacks. You can do everything right in collecting this data and processing the data, and then you're storing some components of that data in a reference database within a central system, and you can have insider attacks go in and change that data. So you have to be protecting against those kind of attacks as well, right? It's not, there's no again, if you're not taking a systemic approach, you're not going to be effective in solving the problem, because you could do all of those other things and then, okay, somebody's in the back end. Great. Now you've undone it all.
Yeah. So again, you have to have ways to flag all of these different types. So, one of the other ones that's obviously interesting, and we will not only talk about it, but I'll show some examples as we move along, is generative AI, right? It is sort of changing the game. And for me, one of the ones that I've talked about the most and that I've seen the most, I hate to say turbocharged or supercharged, but it's becoming such a problem because it's gotten so easy with generative AI is synthetic identities. And I know you've obviously got pieces of the Prism project that talk specifically to that. So I will pass it back over to you.
Yeah, this was so interesting to me because, again, I was having a lot of conversations with people about synthetic identity, and they, again, would start with one or two or three examples that were top of mind in terms of the attacks that they were seeing at their organization. One of the things we see is a velocity attack where you have a single face that's used 1,000 times with 1,000 different sets of data. And so I started thinking about this in terms of how do we break this down to try to identify all the different ways that you can use real data and synthetic data, or what we call counterfeit data, to create synthetic identities. And so we created this little chart, which I really like, because what you see here is that it's not one or the other. It's not real or synthetic. It's a mixture, and these mixtures can be pretty complicated in terms of the approaches you take. And one of the other things I think that's also critically important is when you're talking about synthetic identity, even if you have a synthetic identity in your database, that synthetic identity could include actual genuine PII. And
Right.
Even if you're saying, oh, we're trying to identify these fraudsters with synthetic identities, if you have any real PII in your database, you have an obligation to protect it. So
Right.
you have synthetic identities living inside of your database that you still need to take steps to detect, because there's real data there. And so it gets very complicated. But I think, again, I love this little chart because you can start thinking about the scenarios, the attack scenarios, and how this data can be used. And, it could be, again, people just think, oh, it's deep fakes, or it's fake data, or it's somebody's face with, data that they got off of, biographic data they stole from somebody. But it's way more complicated than that. And again, if you don't have a holistic, systemic approach to addressing these challenges, you're going to miss it, because you can't really iterate every single potential combination of things. It's too complex.
And that's the point, right? The two major issues with synthetic identities are, that first one that you just talked about. It is often leveraging real people's actual information. So you're talking names, addresses, dates of birth, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, stuff that is real. And that information will pass what we traditionally in the industry look at, right? Let me go run a database check at Experian,
Right.
Equifax, or a credit check, and make sure this person is real and this stuff matches up. Well, it does. And that's because, right, all of our information, and I hate saying this out loud, but I continue to say it, all of our information is out there. There have just been too many, just countless data breaches over the last decade where that information is out there, and they're huge data sets. And I'll actually show examples of that later, but that information is out there. So that's issue number one, is that it's, often real information. And then issue number two is what we talked about, right? Generative AI, right? Gen AI now means that you can literally generate an ID with any information that you supply. So again, that includes that real personal information that I just mentioned, for like less than $10. That is problematic. And these sites let you pick from countries, from states, even the ID type that you want, right? You can easily add any photo you want, including generating one on this person does not exist, so that there's any kind of face that you want it to. So you can quickly generate multiple IDs with real personal information and fake faces. And then once you have that fake ID, all you need is a virtual camera to upload it. And virtual cameras are literally free online. So
and this also goes, Adam, it also goes to the idea that people think that somehow humans can actually determine this stuff. There is no way human beings are capable. The idea that anybody is relying on human verification in this world where all of this information is available is, it just is insane, because it's true that we're in an arms race with AI, right? Because we're trying to thwart AI with AI.
Yeah.
But we certainly have no chance of doing it with human beings.
Well, so 2 points that I'll make. One, the arms race thing, we bring it up all the time. We're in an arms race, fraudsters versus the good guys versus bad guys. The problem is they always have a head start because they have no morals and they don't have to worry about, regulations. So, GDPR and all of that other stuff about, controlling PII, they don't care. So it almost always feels like it's a slight game of catch up from this end. But the other thing that I will say, and I actually have an example of this, I don't know that I've even shown you this slide yet. So, this will be a surprise for you too, but
all right, excellent.
some of our forensic agents actually do help us. So there is a place where people do actually work in the process really, really well at catching new things and then adding it to the AI so that, like the models themselves get better. So there is always a human element that still makes a ton of sense. But to your point, just asking a person to tell if something is real, like a one-off, is this thing real or not? Yeah. There's just no way. The fakes have gotten way too good. So what might be interesting, right? So I've shown these examples of somebody actually going in and generating a fake ID with this, older Asian gentleman's face. I actually have a couple of videos that I wanted to play. I genuinely want to show exactly what it looks like from an IDV process. So from our standpoint of somebody going in and sort of, trying to fake out the system with a fake ID and a selfie. So if I can get these to play, we'll see how well I do here. The first one that I'm going to play is actually someone using a virtual camera to capture a picture. So let me hit play and see if that goes. There it goes. So essentially what's happening here is going through an IDV process to do a verification. This person goes in to take a picture of their ID, but you'll see they immediately switch to OBS, which is a free online virtual camera. And so I have to say take a picture because it's telling the system that, hey, you're accessing a camera and you're taking a picture. When the system says, hey, move closer, you just use the zoom feature on it and you can take a picture of it. So that's how fast and easy it is to go generate for, again, $8.99 a fake ID and then use a virtual camera to take a picture of that. Now, hopefully, anybody that is familiar with it or a little bit more familiar with the process is asking the question, okay, but what about the selfie comparison? I mean, they're not gonna be able to fake that person's face, right? Well, unfortunately, let me show you how easy that actually is. Is this run? Yep. So here they go in. Oh wait, that's still the driver's license again. Let me see if I can get it to move forward. There it goes. So this is them going to do the liveness check, right? In this case, they will actually pick a different virtual camera software called Magicam, which by the way is $49.99 a year. So again, still super incredibly cheap to use. And what you'll see is as they go in and select this camera, it will let you with a single frame, a single image, put a digital mask over your face. And you can see he picks the same gentleman that he used for his ID. When liveness comes up and tells you, hey, you have to move closer, you have to smile, you have to turn your head, or even if it's passive liveness, which is just seeing if there's movement or eye blinks, all of those things still happen, right? And it captures that picture of you, which is actually a real picture of a live person. And that's how it does the comparison. So, at the end of the day, like even some of the things that we have for more advanced forms of verification or fraud prevention can be pretty quickly, bypassed. Now, the good news is if you have layered fraud detection, you'll catch that it's injected content, right? Those were coming from virtual cameras. You'll catch that the video stream that selfie was being digitally manipulated. But I think those examples do a good job of showing that it's actually pretty easy from a fraudster's perspective to execute a relatively complex attack. So with those examples, I will turn it back over to you because I know you've got a slide basically on that biometric processing channel and what that means in terms of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, as we, this is literally taken from that larger IDV process image that we showed earlier. And just to give a little insight, this is what we do in the reports. We start with that larger kind of comprehensive process, and then we literally break this down and discuss each point. So again, for those of you that are interested in gaining more understanding and really, from my perspective, having the kind of background and insight that you need to then have a conversation with someone like Adam, where you can actually push him and ask him tough questions, right? That's really what this is going to help you do. So with biometrics, right, you're capturing the live biometric. And as Adam just showed us, there's all kinds of ways to fake that, right? So you have to capture that data, and then really the signal processing box is where
Yeah.
we're talking about liveness and camera detection and all those other things, right? That you have to go through that whole process before you say, okay, yes, we believe this is good data. And then in a case where you're enrolling someone for the first time, you may be doing a comparison to an image captured off a credential. If this is an authentication where someone's previously enrolled, you may actually have a reference, what we call a biometric template being stored, and you would generate the template from that live image that you're capturing and compare those two things. In fact, when we talk about a biometric, we're really talking about the template. We're not talking about the image per se. And so once you've done all those checks, then that data can get pushed into your IDV decisioning engine. And again, I want to just call out, you see those little triangles in this case. That is demonstrating that, you know, the location of potential attacks, and you see them also on the service provider platform. That's where somebody could be doing an insider attack. Again, the whole notion is that this process looks so simple, and it's like, okay, it's step by step, but every single step provides another opportunity for a fraudster to attack your system.
Yeah. So let me actually give an example, and this is a good one where I like this for a couple of different reasons. Number one, I'm just going to call this out because you did such a great job of already mentioning up front, right? You'll notice that ID, I have some things that are whited out. That's because that is an actual real ID of somebody that we saw in production, and so we need to mask their PII, right? That's the kind of thing that you still have to protect against, even though it's a fraudster. So in this example, these are images from a relatively recent attack. Now, through forensic review, and again, this is our forensic agent, so this is where people actually do come in and help. The recurring background images were what were flagged, right? Obviously, pretty quickly, you can tell from velocity, hey, we're seeing this same background too many times. Our team then used AI to inspect the images for digital artifacts of manipulation. Obviously, this person is using a face morph, and add that information to our model. So that essentially adds training data to help the models look for specific artifacts. And that in turn then helps protect the rest of our customers from similar attacks. But what you can see is this single fraudster, and I've got this little arrow to sort of point it out, can essentially look like anyone they want, which means they can even use real IDs if they want to. They can change their lighting, they can change their face to try and morph it to match the image and pass with a real ID. And that's what's so terrifying, again, about synthetics. This is another form of that, where it's a person with a real ID, nothing about that actual identity is fake. It's just a person sort of trying to pretend to be that person. That's using generative AI. But it could have been mismatched images, it could be fake IDs, a bunch of other things. So it's just really, really sort of complicated to talk about. And that's just, you know, the biometrics piece of it. There are also problems, right, on the channel processing side.
Right. So yeah, so when you're looking at, so we looked at biometrics. Now we're looking at credentials. I mean, people say document, but one of the reasons I call this credential and not document is something you mentioned earlier, Adam, which is we're starting to see digital credentials, right? This has to work in a world where you have a physical document or you have a digital credential, and there's different tests and different potential fraud vectors, again, depending on which direction you're going, right? So the whole idea here is, once again, you have to go through a process. You have to, you know, is this an image of a valid physical credential? Is this a valid digital credential? You know, is the cryptographic signature been verified, right? One of the other ways that you can also look at this is there are a whole series of documents out in the world. It's not so much in North America, but certainly across Europe, Asia, and across the rest of the world. There are plenty of documents that have chips embedded in them. Oh, yes. So sometimes you're reading the data off of the chip. So depending on what type of credential you're looking at, this may be a different process in terms of validating that document, the signal processing, as we call it. But again, it's the same issue. You have to make sure that whatever you're looking at is genuine, and that in some cases, again, if this is an enrollment, you're doing one set of checks. If it's a verification, you may have additional checks because you've got to reference that you now have to compare it to. Is this the same credential that showed up with the same person the last time they went through this process? So this is, again, why it's so important to have a holistic approach, because this is it's dynamic. This is not a static process, and you have to be able to account for all the different variables as you're actually trying to do this kind of a verification or authentication.
Absolutely true. And I will circle back to the sort of kind of the templatized version of that here in a second too. But when you mention digital credentials, there's a bunch of different versions of it. There are EIDs, which is what you're talking about, documents with chips in them. And then there are true, like, mobile driver's licenses, MDL, so fully digital electronic copies. And what keeps, I'm not saying it's keeping me awake at night, but it certainly makes me feel older as a person, is, there is an entire wave or generation coming up that is highly likely to never actually have a physical ID. So the way that we currently do some forms of verification will not work moving forward, because you have to do it with a completely digital version. The good news is, right, standards have emerged, ISO 13018, the W3C verifiable credential. Most of the forms of government issued digital IDs, sorry, I shouldn't say digital IDs, electronic IDs, they are following a standard. So if you have a good verification provider that actually understands those standards and can do the actual, cryptographic verification on them, you can still get some pretty broad coverage, but it is changing the game and making it more complex.
And again, you have to be able to operate in an ecosystem where all of these different types of credentials coexist. You can't demand that your customer use some specific thing that you want them to use, right? You have to be able to be prepared for whatever they come to you with that is actually considered a valid identity credential.
Right, exactly true. So I did want to show one other example, because we said templates, and I had this one sort of teed up because I really like this particular slide. But this was from a similar set of IDs that we saw originally in the Netherlands, but then the same template appeared in attacks across the EU within the same week, and then showed up later in the US and Canada. So I'm trying to remember the exact numbers, but I think all in all, we saw more than a dozen different variants of the same template, and more than 1,300 attempts, almost with all constantly changing PII, because we think this was probably from like a purchased or stolen data set, right? So this was an attack at scale, right? Like, this was an organized group attacking. Now, ultimately, it was the exact homogeneity of the document hologram. So that little holographic strip on the ID was the thing that was exactly the same across all of them. That, and I think there were some inconsistencies with the blind embossing. That set off our template attack detection. We could tell that this was the same sort of image over and over and over again with velocity. So the question that everybody has when I kind of show this, because it looks like a very large attack, which again it was, like, how did this play out? Well, obviously we caught the attack, but the reason that I actually like to bring up this second slide is to point this out, right? In 65% of the instances, only one fraud authenticator was triggered. And again, because they were using, real credentials, real data from real people, lots of other things didn't get triggered. So it's why, again, and we've said it 100 times already, but it's why you need many, many different fraud filters.
Well, however, I also think, I'm sorry, Adam, go ahead.
Well, I was just gonna, I was gonna, like, because I feel like we've been doing a lot of, fear and other things, which is good because we're close to Halloween, but I wanted to give, like,
we're trying to scare you.
Yeah, we're trying to scare everyone. But I did want to give a tiny bit of good news, which is, you will also notice, though, that the approval rates for good customers, right, the valid customers, weren't really impacted. So, I mean, it is possible to still provide a great experience and fight fraud at the same time.
Well, and the thing that I wanted to talk about, because I think this is really important, there's a lot of conversations out in the world about a concept called decentralized identity. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of value to decentralized identity, and there's a lot of ways it can be used really effectively. And the idea with decentralized identity is to push as much of the ownership and control of data to the individual. And that's one of the reasons why these verifiable credentials, which is this new method of providing a credential for an individual human, which sits in your device and can be cryptographically validated. And for many, many types of transactions, that's a really good thing to use. You limit the risk and the exposure because you're just keeping that transaction locally between the device in your possession and
And the blockchain ledger will let you know if it's ever been tampered with, right?
Yeah. Exactly. And however, for the kind of thing that you were just talking about, that kind of velocity-driven attack, templatized attack, attacks at scale, if you are not holding some of that data in a centralized manner, then you can't detect those sort of attacks. So you have to balance that, the desire, and I think it's a really an important objective, which is to really minimize the amount of data that we're storing in some kind of centralized repository. At the same time, we cannot fight fraud if we are not managing that data to use it in an effective way to prevent the kind of attacks that you were just talking about.
Absolutely true. And to your point, right, you don't necessarily want to create a honeypot of information, another thing to get breached. But at the same time, right, and we talk about this all the time too, consortium models or other things, information sharing across the industry, because with that template that we're talking about, right, that was moving from one bank to a different bank, not only regionally, but again, from one institution to another institution. When we talked earlier about fraudsters being like water and finding the point of least resistance, if they get stopped at one place, that doesn't mean they pack up and they stop being fraudsters. They just go find another place to go attack. So there is a need to have centralized information, at least on sort of the and I hate to call it bad guys, but you know what I mean, the bad guys front, the fraudster front, so that you can find things like that. And then to your point, being able to at least hold information for a certain period of time so that you can see velocity, so you can see historical information to really create that check, that safety net of, okay, we're starting to see the same hologram 26 times in a row in the span of 10 minutes. Something is weird. So yeah,
we have to be able to do that. If we don't, then we're leaving our enterprises defenseless. And that is not just bad for those enterprises, it's bad for all of us, because these are organizations, especially we're talking about financial services, right, that are holding our financial resources, right, that are dealing with our mortgages and our bank accounts and our retirement accounts and all of those things. So we have to balance the use of the technology in an effective way, in a way that certainly prioritizes privacy and compliance, but also allows us to protect the very data that we're really worried about.
Agreed. So one last one on vulnerabilities, because I know there's another one that you wanted to cover, which is specifically environmental risk. You talked about the 3 different types. So I will turn it over to that slide for you to just kind of tee us up on additional fraud types, which is the environment.
So this is sort of interesting because, again, when you think about these challenges, you think about biometrics, which to me is like linking a human to their digital data. And then you're talking about the credential, which has a lot of biographic information and really goes to the issuer of that identity, right? Which is generally, we think of as a kind of a government agency. And then you have the environmental risk figures, because you could have all the biometrics check out, you could have the credential check out 100%. But now I'm looking at what's my phone identifier? Where am I located? What network am I logging in through, right? Like all the biometrics could check out, all the credential checks could be confirmed, no problem. But there's somehow this signal seems to be originating from someplace that you've never been, or your phone has never been, essentially. And these days, you and your phone are traveling is the same thing. But so it's just another way of adding another layer of fraud detection and risk management to this process. And that's why, again, when we talk about layers, it's really important to think about these different channels and to think about these different layers. But then again, as you talked, about over and over again today, which is how you basically bring those together within a single unified system, so that you can do these cross checks and comparisons and identify like some weird little signal that just isn't aligned. And that may not be a reason to reject somebody. That may be a reason
it just raises your risk threshold.
Right.
Like, okay, that's an alert.
Right. Or do an additional check. Or maybe in some cases, there is some manual intervention that comes in on the backside. Right. So that's why this is important, that you're covering all of these different channels effectively and integrating them in a system that can, allow you to set the kind of risk tolerances and thresholds that are going to work for your organization.
Exactly. If you are a banking institution, it's going to be very low risk threshold. If you are maybe an online gambling organization, maybe you allow a slightly higher amount of risk. I think what you mentioned right about the recognizing the channel, and maybe I'll even throw in a Halloween reference here while we do it. Is the call coming from within the house, right? Oh, the call is coming from within the house. I think that's one of the other ones that we look for when we talk about injection attacks, right? You may see the biometrics matchup, you may see the document is okay, but if it's not actually coming from the device's camera, the actual physical camera on the device, that may be a problem. So the call is not coming, or the image is not coming from within the house, something like that.
Right.
I'm failing
well,
at my Halloween.
The other thing too is, and this is another model which I didn't bring with me today, but you can find it in our reports, is what we call the identity hierarchy. And what that looks at is what kind of transaction are you talking about? Are you talking about using your phone to get on the metro in Washington, D.C.? Because if you're doing that, it's like you really don't need a ton of checks and there's not a lot of risk there. And okay, it's a $2.80 or $3.60 transaction, right? And if I'm going to check my bank balance at a bank, okay, and I want to transfer money from my checking to savings account, that's not really much of a problem, right?
Yeah, but are you moving the money out of the bank in large amounts?
I want to transfer $10,000 to my friend Adam now, right? Okay, well now that's a much bigger risk. There's a much higher threshold. And so again, not all transactions are the same. And I think that's another really important thing to be thinking about as an organization that wants to think about how you deploy identity effectively. You have to, it's not one problem. It's all these different problems, and it depends on the risk level and the value of a specific transaction.
Agreed. Yeah, and this is an example that I gave yesterday when I was speaking at the fraud conference. But when we talk about agentic AI, and obviously collective groan from everyone in the room, agentic AI, agentic AI, agentic AI, everyone freaks out about buzzwords. But people are going to allow agents to do transactions on their behalf. Now, if I set up an agent to transfer $100 to my son off at college, once a week or once a month or something like that, that's okay. And I've set that up and I've made that happen. But just because that agent is allowed to transfer money from my account to my son's account or something like that, doesn't mean that agent should be allowed to transfer $100,000 from my account to any other account it wants to. So having very tightly defined parameters around what agents can do is also something that people have to think about around identity, because agents are just going to be an extension of that individual or that person. And that is really important for people to understand.
I know people talk about, oh yeah, we have to identify agents. I'm like, okay, great. So now you identify the agent. If you can't link that agent back to the human, then you're not really solving the problem. And so then if you can't identify the human, then how does identifying the agent help you, right? So it all comes back to building a cybersecurity ecosystem that is based on foundational human identity and making those links back to a human based on the risk and the value of transactions. What does that look like? How do you build that out in your organization so that that is consistent with the risk framework that you're already operating under? Yeah.
Well, so I've got one more slide. It was basically tying into this environmental risk and actually speaking to injection attacks. It's obviously pretty hard to show a real injection attack on a slide, but I think the video examples that I played earlier did show sort of how one can be done. What I will do though is highlight this example where we saw a coordinated attack at a major global bank. In this case, the attackers were consistently using servers to inject videos through jailbroken Google smartphones as part of a mass onboarding scheme. And so each attempt used a different selfie and different document, right? Again, all likely part of PII from some leaked data set. But this happened because the institution was running a promotion on new account openings, right? So the fraudsters were trying to open as many accounts as possible, get the sign-up bonuses, and then they just abandon the accounts, right? But it's a way to get free money. And so there's also things when you think about environmental, you also need to understand seasonality. You also need to understand as an organization when you are about to do something that may change the amount that fraud tries to attack you or how it tries to attack you. You know, the good news on this slide again, and I am trying to at least throw in good news where I can, right, is, you know, again, 70% of the cases, only one risk authenticator was triggered. But again, in the entire process, it didn't really adversely affect the good customer experience.
Right.
So again, with the right partner, it is still possible to create a really good experience.
Yeah, and customer experience is critical. You can't, right? If you build a cybersecurity identity framework that blocks half the people that are trying to come to your organization, that is not a good thing. That's not effective.
Yeah, that's a bad business model. You don't want to,
Right.
you don't want to block all of your customers.
And again, this goes back to just my comments about the Prism project and the reports we put out. Like, we highlight organizations like Mitek that is literally, they are solving these problems today. There are solutions. They are not perfect. They are not 100%. No form of security is, right? Identity security is not going to be secure, more secure. Identity-based security is not going to be more secure than password-based, you know, security, in the sense that you're holding it to a different standard. It's never going to be 100%, right? Passwords, you get 100% match, but they can be cracked easily, right? Identity, you're not getting 100% match. There's definitely some thresholds. You're never going to solve the problem, but it is so much of a better solution that can enhance people's experience and provide you with a way of actually growing your business, reducing your fraud, and creating new avenues, actually even for revenue within your organization, that are far more secure than using the traditional methods of security, passwords, SMSs, all these things we do that really are not verifying that you're actually dealing with the right human being.
No, they assume that you know something, but they don't assume that you are who you are. Or they don't prove out or verify that you are who you are. So this last slide that I have, honestly, was just, it was part of a conversation that we had with that particular institution from my last example. And you know, unfortunately, they actually didn't implement all of the fraud defenses that we offer, because they were concerned about that customer experience. But after we did the postmortem on that attack, and they really realized that it was a new type of attack that they hadn't experienced before, they very quickly conceded that sort of having layered defenses in advance would have stopped the attack a lot sooner. Yeah. So, you know, we mentioned it earlier on the layered piece. It's not only about the thing that you showed up worried about, or the one attack that you're under right now. It's sort of trying to create a bigger moat around your organization, and adding in more filters, so that things that you're not even aware of that are coming sort of still get filtered out.
Yeah, it's important to find vendors that can provide solutions to the problem that is, like, you know, the #1 problem you have today. But if you're not looking more broadly, then you're really missing the opportunity, and you're just going to set yourself up. You're going to go through a lot of investment, time, money, and energy, and you're still not going to end up where you want to be.
Catching as much as you'd like. Yeah. So with that, I think we're almost right on time here. In fact, we're a little bit early. We're 12 minutes left. So we're going to open it up to Q&A, and I will try and pull up the channels here for any questions that we have, and see what we've got for either Maxine or myself. All right, so it looks like at least one question that I'm seeing, which is, you know, Maxine, you had mentioned that the Prism reports are available and free to download. So I will make a public service announcement now too. As a reminder, we will be sending out the recording of this webinar afterwards, and along with that, we will send out a QR code so that people can go and actually download any of the Prism reports that they want. So do be on the lookout for that after the webinar. So any other questions, feel free to put them into the questions. Otherwise, we will just assume that Maxine and I have done an amazing job of explaining everything.
Yes, no one has any questions. Well, and again, you may find that if you have questions, you know, often what happens to me is, like, 5 minutes after the webinar ends, I'm like, oh, wait, I really wish I'd asked that question. You can feel free to reach out to us.
Absolutely.
I can be easily found on LinkedIn, Maxine Most. And I think also, again, just to Adam's point, I encourage people to take a look at these Prism reports, because there may be some really good answers to questions you have, and there may be information that you hadn't even considered that you need to know, sort of beyond your ability at this point even to ask a question.
Yeah, and again, I think there are organizations at every level of sort of understanding what they need, or how to manage identity. the Prism reports that Maxine puts out are an incredible primer for sort of getting yourself up to speed on that if you don't really understand the space. If you are at a different place where you sort of understand it, or you have a particular process in place for your identity verification, but you're finding that there are holes, or you're finding that you're not catching the fraud that you want, always happy to have those conversations, and just be open and honest about sort of how far along you are in the process, because I think there are lots of great resources out there to help people sort of get smarter about how to implement good identity verification in their processes.
Yeah, I'm basically trying to arm you, so when you have those conversations with Adam, you can ask questions that, again, as I mentioned earlier, that are going to be super helpful to you, and that are going to press Mitek and Adam on what they are delivering and how they can help you. And that's really my role, is to empower the end users. It looks like there was one question there.
Let's see.
Adam.
Where'd it go? Let me take a quick look. Live partner. Are your solutions live yet? And if so, how effective are they? Yeah, so I'm going to assume that's for me, since the Prism reports are live. Yeah, so Mitek does have both an identity verification platform. We also have a biometric authentication offering. So what that allows you to do is, when you are going through the process of doing that initial identity verification, where you take a picture of the document and then you do the selfie comparison, all of the pieces that I talked about are already in place in terms of making sure it's not a deep fake, making sure it's not injected content, making sure that we haven't seen the face too many times. So all of those examples I gave were from live production that we've actually seen some fraud that we've caught already. But what I didn't mention is, when you're doing that initial setup and you take that selfie image, that selfie image can actually be used later. So we can create a template of that biometric, and you can use that at later stages for step-up authentication. So if I want to change my email address on my banking account, if I want to transfer $100 or $1,000 or $10,000, whatever level our clients want, we can actually ask the person to retake a selfie. And that selfie acts as another form of authentication to make sure the person that's asking to do that thing is really the person they're supposed to be. Because and I'm not going to get on a soapbox about on-device biometrics versus cloud biometrics, but my wife's face can get her onto my phone. If my banking app says, okay, all you need is your face to get into the app, and then you can do whatever you want, well, then my wife can get in and drain my savings account anytime she wants, which is fine because she already has access to all of it anyway. But again, if that's the only thing that's stopping your 15-year-old kid, whose face is also on your phone, from ordering beer through Boozy or something like that, that's not a great thing, right? That's not actually verifying that the person doing the action is the person they're supposed to be. It's just verifying that that person has access to the device. So our biometrics are in the cloud and make sure that you can do that authentication from any device. If someone steals my phone, I can still get in on my wife's phone or somebody else's phone and very quickly authenticate into my app and shut my card down, or make sure that I change the passwords or do something else on any device that I need to. So there are really some benefits to having biometrics in the cloud. We also offer that solution, which is a very long-winded way of getting around to the answer to that question.
Well, it's interesting too, is I have an app for my auto insurance, and every time I log on and use my face, it puts up a little warning that says that if you use face login, we can't. It doesn't guarantee. It only guarantees that the person who has access to the device is getting into your account. It's really interesting. It's the first time I've seen that pop up somewhere. I'm like, so they're clearly trying to protect themselves against those device-based authentications.
100%. Let's see, there's two more questions. Does Mitek have the capability to process online biometrics like IP addresses, device ID, like a digital identity of the risk accounts? So most of the first part of that question, it sounds like, is actually asking about behavioral biometrics and or device biometrics. So are we processing device ID, IP address, that kind of stuff? So are we doing device fingerprinting? We do have some of those capabilities, yes. There are other companies that do purely device fingerprinting to make sure, hey, this is always the same phone that you're logging in from. But we do gather that information. It's actually part of how we do the authentication on the MyPass solution, which is our biometric authentication. So we flag it as an additional risk factor if it is coming from.
Those are the risk signals coming in, yeah.
Right, but obviously we don't say no, you can't get in, because again, that's the whole point of having it in the cloud, is so you can do that biometric authentication from anywhere. But we will flag it as a risk so that if the person that suddenly wants to change their email address is doing it from a different device than they've ever done it from before, you can maybe throw in an additional verification step or something like that.
When you travel, that happens, right? You have to re-verify on the accounts you've been using on your phone like every day, because now your IP address is somewhere else, and they're like, okay, you know, we want to make sure it's you.
Yeah,
which is a good thing. That's a good thing, people, not a bad thing.
Yeah, historical information is good too. If every single week I'm logging in from Austin, Texas, and that's what I do, and then all of a sudden I'm logging in from Fort Worth like yesterday, or San Diego last week, right? If that doesn't happen very often, or hasn't happened in 2 years ever, please, by all means, flag me and have me do an additional step up. And then let's see, have you found any cases of AI applications that have passed through the Mitek solution and have had to react to them, or do you feel you're ahead of the techniques? Appreciates an ongoing battle. I'm going to be brutally honest. Yeah, absolutely. There are versions of fraud that get through. I mean, like Maxine talked about, and I'm not going to pretend that it's any different. There is no silver bullet. There is no solution that catches 100% of fraud. If anybody's out there telling you as an organization they can catch 100% of fraud, please treat that with an enormous grain of salt and caution.
Run away from that. Yeah, you just run away.
That is a used car salesman. Yeah. So yeah, there are versions of AI applications that get through. One of the bigger ones for us right now that we're constantly battling is deepfakes. The challenge is that there are so many different deepfake engines out there, and they're advancing so quickly that looking for specific artifacts from each of them is a challenge. We have a huge team, which we call our purple team. If anyone's familiar with cybersecurity, there are typically red teams which do attack vectors. There are blue teams which do defensive measures. We use a purple team where our guys are actually trying to break the system themselves. And then as soon as they figure out, okay, this new thing that just came out, I just tested with it, and it gets through our own system, we create our own ways to sort of shore up that hole, and then we move that to production with our engineering and our product management team. So it is a constant and ongoing battle. The nice thing is we've got a very large breadth of global financial services customers that allow us to spend a lot of time looking at their data and the attacks that they get. And so when we harden for the financial services sector, believe me when I tell you, it's good enough for 99.999% of the rest of the sectors. They are a much harder clientele to keep up with, because frankly, banks are where fraudsters go first. It is where the money is.
And I just want to close with one more thing that I think is really important. Kind of takes us back to where we started, which is this is an ecosystem. This is a collaborative ecosystem of global digital identity, and no one is going to do this on their own. No single company, no single organization. This requires an ecosystem approach where there's collaboration and cooperation between vendors and end users and across the vendor ecosystem. And that is the only way we're going to be able to try to, if not stay ahead, at least maintain our position in fighting all of this fraud.
Yeah, continue to fight. Well, I think that does it for all of the questions. I did want to say once again, thank you to everyone for attending. And one more time, remind you to be on the lookout. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar, as well as a copy of the Prism report. So do pay attention to that. And with that, I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.